First of all, there have been a number of errors made this morning. One was I had to correct Elder Kiss, who seems to think that the guava is a wonderful fruit. At least I got that impression. And he remembers the first time that he had it. I also remember the first time, and the last. And I've never had it since. So that was the first thing, and you've got to make this a bit light, you know. And the second thing, he made a mistake when he said that he knew the first moment he was going to marry his wife. That was a mistake. He only thought he knew. Because the reality is, we as men do not decide who our partners are. They decide for us. And if you don't believe it, I go back to the Irish singer, who some of you, if you're old enough, will remember, Val Doonican. Who remembers him? Such a wise man. In fact, he had, I think, 2 or 3 of his children, well, his wife did, in the sanitarium on the park. You remember? Yeah. When we were growing up, Victor and I. Victor and I, unfortunately, are sort of similar in age. So we go back a long way. Anyway, so as I say, he was a very wise man because he sang a ballad that was going around when we were growing up, which was, "A man chases a woman until she catches him." So that's a maybe. Anyway, we better get started. I was also going to say, I thought Earl made a good comment this morning because he's a treasurer, I'm a treasurer, Victor's a treasurer. You know, we're all former treasurers, and none of us seem to be able to count, because the interesting thing is that the room seemed a lot fuller last night than it does this morning. And I'm trying to figure out that one, but I guess we have to leave the younger people to do the counting to see if that makes sense. But anyway. In my new role, I'm now looking after Adventist risk management, and my friend down there made a comment that I'm heading that department, and that's also a mistake because I've got 4 ladies working with me, and so how can anyone be in control? I hope you're not getting the impression that I'm anti-women, because I'm not. I'm married to one. Anyway, we better get started. Adventist risk management is an arm of the church which was established to protect our assets, or the church's assets. And I thought last night Elder Sam's comment was quite interesting, because he said that it's our responsibility to make sure those assets are protected. And I think that's very true. It is our responsibility. And so as a relationship to that, if we don't make sure that they're properly protected, then we're accountable, okay? And we're accountable to God for not making sure that things are properly protected. Another interesting factor is that for those of you who like policy and read it, General Conference Working Policy S60 makes the statement that it's the responsibility of the treasurer of the union conference, to make sure that assets are properly protected. And so one of the concerns that I have, and of course I'm no longer a treasurer, so it doesn't fall under my area anymore, but one of my concerns is that as local church treasurers, what we sometimes find is that when we try to value a property, or church property, there is reticence to value it at its proper value. Why? I need you to help me a little bit, because, you know, I find it difficult talking, and it's nice when you get some feedback. But I'm not getting any feedback. But anyway, why is it important that it's valued at its proper value? Sorry? If it's burnt down? But that never happens, does it? Because nothing bad ever happens to good people. Huh? It does? Okay. But why would you not want to value your property at its correct value? Yeah, because it's expensive, or it's more expensive than undervaluing it. And that's one of the things I found. In fact, just as an aside, I need to hit something else. Adventists are a mean people, you know. They don't like spending money. And treasurers are even worse. And my son will tell you that I'm even worse still. But the reality is treasurers don't like spending money. And I can remember some years ago when I went to a general conference session, the comment, and I don't remember which one it was now, but the comment that came out of there was, the Adventists came and they went. They came with the 10 Commandments and a $10 bill, and they left without breaking either. And there's an element of truth in that. But it also says something in the Bible about scoffers. And whenever there's a free meal, I notice that we all tend to partake in fairly generous helpings. But anyway, that's the thing. The other thing that I think we need to look at is time. And I see they've got it's difficult because Elder Kiss said he got 20/20 vision still, but I don't. But I see there's a clock down there telling me how much time I've got, and yeah, I can't see it very well, sorry. But it's interesting that I also recall reading recently, or reminded of something that came up, and that is that there are two things in this world, well, I think three, but two things in this world that you can't control. And there's an old adage that time and tide man has no control over, and I would say there were three things: man, tide, and your wife, because they tend to do as they please, and you have very little control, except in the case of Victor, who always manages to. Yes, well, even managing time and tide is not easy. Anyway, so if we can carry on a little bit, having said about the properties, it's important that we value the properties correctly, because if there's a claim, you want to be able to, and I will go through some of the slides, but I find going through slides a bit boring, so I like to try and cover it beforehand. The issue for me is that if you don't cover the property appropriately and value it correctly, and yes, you have to pay the premium on it, but if you don't, you have the problem that when there's a claim, and as I say, bad things do happen to good people, or vice versa, and when it happens, you want to be put back in the position you were before it happened. And if you don't properly cover yourself, you will not be put back in the position that you were in. And the one good thing about Adventist risk management, which is different from some insurance companies, is that if let's say your property is valued at £4 million and you only had cover for 2 million, even if you had a 2 million loss, you would still get paid out up to 2 million. In other words, you would be covered for the full amount that you're insured for. Most insurance companies would say if you were 50% underinsured, then you'll only get 50% of the claim. So that's one good thing, but it doesn't detract from the fact that if you don't have the proper coverage, you could land up with a real problem if you have a loss. So I think it's important to make sure that we have appropriate coverage. And I know that since I've been back, we've been trying to get the property values correctly assessed. One of the things that comes up is you have two things. You have the rebuilding cost of a property and you have its current market value. And historically, I think most people have felt that the rebuilding cost should be lower than the market value. And in some cases that is true, but in many cases these days we're finding out that the rebuilding cost is more expensive than the actual property value or the saleable value. Now, I guess going back a bit, we felt that the price should be lower if it was rebuilding because you don't have to buy the land again. It's basically indestructible. I say basically because you can't really damage land that much, but you could make a mess of it. So it should be cheaper, but it isn't in many cases now. And so a lot of the rebuilding costs are coming out now more expensive than either you paid for the property, even if you bought it fairly recently. So we're having to look at that, and we're going through a process, and we've now completed, I guess, a fair quantity of the properties of the British Union anyway, and Newbold College. And I think we're on a program now to start moving ahead with the conferences, the churches, the North and South. I know that the North is planning to get valuations done, which we're going to help with. The South is planning to do it, at least I believe you are, Earl, because I think all the churches need to get their properties correctly valued. We had a case, or we've had a couple of cases where there have been losses on properties and they weren't properly covered. And at least in one case, I think the church is having to move to another area and buy another property in order to retain the church, because the amount of payout is not sufficient to rebuild the church. So it is important that we make sure that happens. Another thing that I wanted to bring up was on builder's risk. You've got the property value, so let's say your property is valued at £1 million, and then you decide to do an extension, which happens quite often, and you're going to do an extension for £1.5 million. You should take builder's risk insurance on that, which is an add-on to the policy, so that anything that goes wrong whilst it's being built is covered. And then at the end, you add that to the value of the insured, so that you're fully protected. So I think that covers that part of it. Then you have to look at what is not covered under property insurance. Can you think of any examples of what's not covered? Contents is not covered under property itself, and we'll come on to that in a few minutes. Anything else? Public liability is a separate issue, you're right, which we're going to cover as a separate exercise altogether, because public or general liability is a very important issue, and that comes up all the time, particularly with the churches who require public liability coverage, particularly if they rent from outside organisations. It's a requirement. So we will be covering that as a separate issue apart from property and contents. But anything else that you know is not covered? Lightning is not covered. Natural disasters, it depends. Some is, some isn't. I think one of the interesting things is at what point do you decide what is and what isn't covered? And how can you know? What did someone say? Read the policy? Read the small print, yes. Then you've got to have 20/20 vision. But it's true. Read the policy. And I've always found, I mean, men are strange creatures, you know. I find, particularly in myself, I will never ask directions. If I get lost, I get lost, but I won't ask directions. And I think that's something that men don't like doing. And the other thing is I've always found is if you try and put something together, the last thing you do is read the instructions. You know, I can do it without reading the instructions. And when it doesn't work, then I read the instructions and then wonder why I've broken it before I got to actually putting it together. So yes, it's very important to read the policy, because the policy tells you what is there and what is not there, what you're covered for and what you're not covered for, and the limits that you're covered for. And you know, some people get a little bit confused, because you can have a claim for, you know, £5,000 if it's a relatively small claim, and then you land up, when you put everything in, getting 4,500 or something, and you say, well, why didn't I get everything? Well, there was an excess on the policy, or I think we call it excess here. In America they call it deductible, but it's the same thing. In fact, in many ways, deductible probably makes more sense, but there you are. So you're going to get a deductible on the policy, and if you don't want the deductible, then you pay a higher premium. So it swings and roundabouts. But the important thing is that we are covered for all of our properties and all of our contents. Do you feel that all your properties are covered appropriately? Who feels their property is valued at its full rebuilding value? Yours? Sorry? You, okay, well, and maybe some of them are, but I think the experience we've had over certainly the last few months, is that most properties within the South England Conference and the North England Conference, but particularly the South, where values tend to be somewhat higher, is that properties are significantly undervalued. I can think of this one church property that we're talking about that was a total loss, and I'm not going to mention names, but it was like 52% undervalued. 52%. That is a lot, and that makes it almost impossible to rebuild, because even if you have covered yourself for X amount of money and ARM are going to pay you out the full amount, as long as it's, you know, that's the claim, you're still going to be short by 52%. That doesn't help you in the case of real need. Sorry, you had a question. Yeah, and we're obviously having a look at that, and that's got to be done. But you know, there are so many churches, but we need to look at that, and I hope we're going to. Yeah, same number of premiums. Victor likes to mention that, and so I'm going to listen to that. But as I say, we are trying to get all the properties valued now, because I think it's very important, and we're working with the conference on that, so we should be able to get that done. Any other questions on the property before we get into content? Yes.
but we feel the amount is adequate for your area of district. Because as Graham says, some of the before the revaluation was done, we found that many of our churches were grossly uninsured for what would be expected to be the rebuild cost of those properties. But we'd be right out to offer you the opportunity to have a formal valuation done with a three-way sharing of that cost.
Are you saying you had a valuation done very recently?
Yeah, by 2014, 2013.
Ah, but that, all right. But the exercise you're talking about was an exercise that Earl and I went through, just looking at the various properties and making an informed guesstimate of where those properties should be based on how long we've had them, what the original purchase price was, and looking at a number of different factors. So obviously if a property had been purchased in the last year or so, there would be very little adjustment. If it was purchased 40 years ago and cost £20,000, and in some cases we had properties which were valued very, very low, which clearly was no way representing the rebuilding cost in today's terms. So we looked at that, and we also looked at this 52% issue of one or two of the churches that were undervalued. So that valuation was done as the best guesstimate we could come to before actually assessing a full valuation. And so what I'm saying is, and I think Earl would agree with this, if we have a proper professional valuation done and it's determined that in your case or any other church that our guesstimate was too high, then the value could drop. But it would also go up if the valuation was proved to be wrong. But I think the whole idea is to try and get the properties to the correct values so that you are properly insured in the event of a significant loss. Yes.
Yes. My question is, are you or anyone in the conference, are you going to do a professional estimate or evaluation on the churches in the South England?
Yes.
Or other churches?
That's what we're saying.
Yeah, are you going to do that? Send someone around?
We're going to. The idea at the moment is because trying to get round every single church. I mean, how many churches have we got? 300? About 300 between north and south. Yeah, but all right then. I'm not sure how many exactly in the south, but however many there are, to get round to every single one would take a fair amount of time. And so the idea is that we want to get a professional to do it. And the idea I think that Earl had was that we get someone locally, possibly of your choosing, in the local area to do the valuation who's a professional, and they will come up with the valuation, produce a proper report saying what the value of the property is. Then it's not guesstimate any longer, it's the best professional estimate that you can get. Now, yeah. An estimate is an estimate, and it's never going to be 100% because what it is today will change tomorrow, and it can go up or down.
Yeah, but the reason I asked that, I think when one was sent to us by the conference, and when we look at it, we found that the estimate was so much higher, it was about 4 times the original value. We know, I know it was undervalued.
Yes.
But I didn't expect it to have gone up to the figure
but
it is.
I don't know which church we're talking about, but that was what I was trying to explain, was that when we went through and did this estimate, it was based on a number of criteria, one being that we knew that some properties were significantly undervalued, and then also taking account of Earl's significant knowledge on the property portfolio of the conference, knowing when something was purchased. So if it cost 100,000 30 years ago, it's clearly going to be valued far greater than that now. So you could go up 3 or 4 times quite easily. If you think of I don't know what your situation is, but if you think what your house cost you, I know what my house cost me 35 years ago and what it's worth today. And there's no relationship between the value that I paid for it and what it's worth today. I mean, the guy that lives next door to me, I was talking to him over the weekend, and he told me that when he bought his house, which obviously is next to mine, he paid £6,000, okay? £6,000. And just as an aside, those houses, when they were built new, were selling for 450, I think that was the figure. £450. And the younger generation sit there and laugh and say, that's nothing. But it was a lot of money then. And those of you that are a bit older, you know how difficult it was buying your houses then. So this argument that things are so much more expensive now, yes, they're expensive now, but they were expensive then on the salaries we were earning. So the guy next door to me paid $6,000. And the houses are probably worth $450,000 now. Somewhere around there. I know one sold in the road for $455, I think, the other day. So, and if we want to say that it was in great condition inside, it may have been. But the reality is, when people move in, they tend to move out everything that was in. All the old goes out and new comes in. And I've seen across the road from us, there have been about 3 skips recently where everything that the people had only recently put in had been taken out and they were putting what they wanted in. So if you're saying it's gone up 4 times, and I don't know which property we're talking about, it's very probable that it is grossly undervalued, or was grossly undervalued. But as I say, if we get the professional valuation done now, and it's deemed that the figure we put on it was too high, it will be adjusted back to what the professional valuation says. So, but you're going to be very sorry if you've got it valued at 100,000 and you need $1 million to replace it if it burns down. So, yeah.
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
You're talking about getting the property for the payment, okay? And is there any financial help?
Well, yeah. That's what we were saying. Earl has come up with the recommendation, and ARM are committed to helping in that. And the arrangement we have with the South, and I haven't discussed it with the North yet, but the arrangement is that we feel there needs to be ownership on the part of the local body. So the idea was 1/3 for the local church, 1/3 for the conference, 1/3 for ARM. And I mean, I think I wrote to Earl and committed a certain amount of money, but I also said in that it was a cap. But that doesn't mean to say it's the cap completely. It's just that we need to discuss if we need more. I think it's important, and I'm certainly committed to making sure that all the properties get valued correctly, because I think we have a responsibility. In just the same way as that policy S60 requires that the treasurer is responsible, I think ARM is also responsible for making sure that the church's assets are protected, because that's what we were created for. It is an arm of the church to make sure that assets are properly protected. And so, yes.
You said that you're committed. You say that you're committed, to getting these revaluations done.
Yes.
So what is the process? How? Because as our local church, we'd like to get it done as soon as possible.
Right. Well, my understanding is, and I haven't discussed this fully with Earl yet, but my understanding was in talking with him, and he can comment on that after, my understanding is that the suggestion was that we allow each local church to arrange for a professional valuation to be done.
Oh, right.
You arrange for it, and then you will submit the bill to the conference, and they will reimburse you 2/3, and I will be picking up 1/3.
Okay, thank you.
So it doesn't have, in other words, you don't have to wait for us to try and get round to everybody. Everybody can arrange to get their own done, but the criteria is it must be a professional valuation, and we don't want just somebody sitting in a committee or the local church board saying, I think the property's worth 300,000, so that's it. Because that's not a professional valuation, unless you're a professional. And sometimes we have that kind of situation where somebody thinks they know better than professionals. My argument to that will be, if we do a valuation and it comes out at 3 million, and you think it's only worth $1 million, well, that's fine. But don't tell me that the valuation is wrong. If you don't agree with it, get another valuation done. It's the same thing with the law system. If you don't agree with the ruling of a court, you don't say that the court was wrong. You go back to the court and ask for a reassessment. So, yeah. Yes. I'm just trying to open it up to questions because otherwise it's... Yeah.
Can I understand that the 30% you're taking, the 30% the conference is taking and the church...
It's actually 33 1/3 if you're a treasurer.
Okay.
See, Victor, the older generation can still count.
The 33%...
Yes. And 1/3.
Those would be the cost of valuation, is that right?
Yes.
But I'm a little not concerned, but just wanted clarification. What would happen after you get this valuation back and you find that the property is significantly undervalued?
Yes.
I would imagine that you'd want to insure them at the correct valuation.
Well, at the end of the day, if the valuation comes in much higher than the current value, what we call the SOV, the statement of value on the property, if that value is lower than it should be, the decision as to whether you go up or down is yours or the conference. And that's something else I wanted to cover because I think it's important. Let me ask another question. Who owns your church? The conference? No. 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 The conference does not own the property. The Seventh-day Adventist Association owns the property. Okay? But there is one problem that I've perceived as I've been around a while because, as I say, my mother not only kissed the front of my head, she kissed the back. And one of the things that I've noticed is that local churches think that they own the property. Okay? They think they do. Now, you know there's a very good reason why they don't own the property? Because in the past, disaffected members, if it's not owned by the legal association, can walk off and do what they want. Now, the reality is, if you want to sell your property and get another one, you're not going to have a problem. You normally are able to do that. But it's a preventative measure to make sure that you don't walk off with the property. So the conference doesn't own the property, although they paid for it probably, and you did. The legal association, which means, unfortunately, the person that can't count, looks after your property. Sorry, Steve. And so what I'm saying is, if the property is undervalued, Steve, the idea would be that it should be valued at its correct value. And the question I then have is, who has the right to say what it should be valued at? Because to be honest with you, we had a few churches, as I picked up, that came back and said, we don't want the property valued at what it's been estimated to be worth. We think it's only worth so much. Okay? Now that was probably done because of the reason that I gave you a few minutes ago, that the feeling is, if the value is more, then the premium is going to be more. And that's pretty good logic. But the reality is, do you have the right to undervalue your property when it's legally owned by the association? And the other question I would ask you is, as a local church treasurer, do you want it to be under your watch that the church burns down and the members have nowhere to go? Because at the end of the day, if it goes down and you were undervalued, you're going to be going cap in hand to Earl saying, can you give me another £1 million to buy the property or repair the property? And Earl's going to say, yes, of course. We'd be happy to give you an extra £1 million. I mean, all treasurers are like that. They like giving more money. It's part of their genetics.
Graham,
Yes.
I think for the sake of clarity, what value we are talking about is actually the rebuilding value of your building rather than the market value, because the market value does not necessarily represent the rebuild cost.
Yeah. Well, I think I covered that by saying, I think I covered that, didn't I? The rebuilding cost is what we really want, because that's what it's going to cost to rebuild the building. The market value may or may not truly reflect that value, and so when you have a valuation done, it is very important that you ask for a rebuilding cost, because that's what you need. Yeah.
Can I just...
Sorry, yeah. I didn't give you a chance to speak. It's a failing of mine.
What I just wanted to find clarification from you is, if you, for example, find out that the rebuild value is higher, I'm sure you're going to adjust the premiums up. Would that be right?
It's a reasonable assumption, yes.
Yeah.
I said it's a reasonable assumption, or it's not unreasonable. I think Alan Redfern, who probably most of you know, will never say something is reasonable or not reasonable. He always says it's not unreasonable.
Yeah. Assuming you're going to say yes.
Yes. I just did.
Who would pay those premiums, and how would that come back to the local church to take that?
Well, who's getting the benefit of the local church? The members are getting the benefit, so I'm assuming that they will pay the premium, but I believe in certain cases, depending on whether you are from, well, let's just put it this way, I think in some cases, some churches get some help in certain conferences, and in other conferences they don't.
And in your prophetic, in your view, do you think they would be so large that they could possibly bankrupt the church for those churches that have huge undervaluation of their properties?
I wouldn't have thought so, because the premiums are not that great. It's a very small amount of the value. I wouldn't have thought so, but let me tell you, the alternative is much worse. I mean, I would hate, as a local church treasurer personally, to be responsible, as I think Victor and I personally feel. We don't want it going down on our watch that something burns down and we don't have the money to replace it. So I think it's a very, we're making light of it to some extent, but it's a very serious issue. And I think we can't overemphasize the fact that for the small amount of premium we're talking about, it's important to have it properly valued. And I'm quite sure that if there were certain churches, and I'm maybe speaking out of turn here, but if there were certain churches that really had financial problems, I'm sure that the conference would give assistance in those instances. That would be my, because they do belong to the SDA Association, and I think both the conference and the association have some right to say what they should be valued at. Now, we haven't actually got on to, have you found this helpful? I mean, I've got a lot more that we should have covered. We haven't covered...
I have a final question here.
Sorry?
One final question here.
Yes?
Okay, so the point I was going to make is that as a church, we're fantastic at doing things DIY by ourselves. We need to be careful that when we get these valuations, they're done by
That's what I said.
approved valuation companies.
Yep.
So we need to make it clear when you send out the notices to the churches, they need to be registered companies to do the valuation.
I'm beginning
I didn't hear you, sorry.
I'm beginning to wonder whether I actually speak English, because
I didn't hear you, sorry.
I know that I lived in America for a number of years, and that's another interesting thing. America and England speak the same.
One last quick thing.
Yeah.
Once we've done this valuation piece,
yes,
if we don't have a process in place to do revaluations in the future, in 5 years' time we'll be back at the same point.
It
so
needs to be an ongoing process, yes. Because You know, you can apply inflation, and there are building indices that we can look at to give us a rough idea, and we do that. But the reality is things change, and you know, you can't say you did a valuation today and in 10 years' time that's just by adding 5 or 10% a year or whatever the inflation factor is, that's going to represent the rebuilding cost. So it needs to be an ongoing process of valuing the properties and revaluing the properties. Have I lost my time? Okay, well, we've got another session. I hope you found this helpful. If you've got any questions, you know, ask Earl or one of the staff back in the office, because I probably can't answer them. But yeah, anyway, thank you for your time. I do have a small brochure which should be handed out probably. It's just a basic brochure about ARM. It is an updated one, Victor. We've taken out all the people who no longer work there, and we've tried to use English terms rather than American terms. And I was starting to say that England and America are two countries, and I think Winston Churchill made the statement many years ago. England and America are two countries divided by a common language. And believe me, if you've lived there, you'll find that to be the case, because they don't understand us. But, you know, we don't understand them either. So. Thank you.